Alright, Ronan MMA, welcome back to the channel. Now, some big news dropped while I was away, and I haven't done videos on all of it, but I want to do one now. So, Francis Ngannou obviously signed with the PFL. Some of the details of that contract have been released. Some have been a little more vague, and I want to talk about some of those details. I want to maybe supply some nuanced positions and or counter arguments for the details in that contract. I also want to talk about the UFC's response to the news of Francis Ngannou signing with the PFL being broken, and how journalists have responded to what the UFC did in that regard. Before we get into it, please like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it, dude. First, I want to say that you cannot criticize any move of Francis Ngannou's or, basically any part of him or anything, or there's a large swath of fighters that this also applies to, without getting called a hater. Okay, now I don't hate Francis Ngannou. I've never said that I hated Francis Ngannou. I've also never said that I wanted him to fail or I wanted him to make no money. I have just been pretty objective while looking at this, and then being objective apparently just gets you the label of a hater of whatever, which is silly, because I think that while the Francis Ngannou super hardcore fans, or I don't even really consider them fans. I think that they're just anti-UFC fans, essentially. I think that a big narrative now they have begun to push is that the other side, which would be the people that were being objective and looking at this from an objective stance, which then comes off as hating, have moved the goalpost, which I find quite humorous, because that seems to be all they have been doing this entire time. They have made the net so wide that it was almost impossible for Francis Ngannou to take an L or to fumble the bag or any of the things that have been brought up. I want to go over the contract details that have been released, okay? And to be fair, again, it's just what has been released, so we don't know. So a little bit of this will be conjecture and guesswork, and whatever, it is what it is, dude. I'm still trying to remain objective. But once again, I don't hate Francis Ngannou. I'm just providing a narrative that maybe you haven't heard before, and if you don't like it, too fucking bad, okay? So one point that got brought up was a high 7-figure purse per fight, okay? It's a little strange to me that they would be so vague on that number, because we know that the UFC offered $8 million, and I want to touch on that briefly. There's been a lot of people that keep fucking manipulating that number into saying, oh, well, that was for all 4 fights, or, oh, that was the whole purse that him and John Jones were to split between one another, which would then get them $4 million each. None of this is fucking true. This is all bullshit. I don't know where these rumors are coming from. Okay, first of all, if they were gonna do a split on a large purse, John Jones would objectively be the A side. He would probably get more than 50% of that purse. But regardless of that, again, go and listen to Francis Ngannou's interview with Ariel Helwani when this first started happening. He said, the UFC told me I would be the highest paid heavyweight ever in the UFC. Ariel Helwani says, okay, well, I know that Brock Lesnar made $8 million for UFC 200. Is it around that? And Francis has a fat smirk on his face, and he says, yes. Okay? He was offered $8 million. There was not a split in play. It was not $8 million for 4 fights. It was $8 million for 1 fight. Otherwise, he would have not been the highest paid heavyweight in the UFC. And considering Ariel Helwani knew the details of that and knew that Brock Lesnar was previously the highest paid guy who got $8 million for 1 fight at UFC 200, Francis Ngannou was going to make more than Brock Lesnar. Even if it was just by $100,000 or whatever, he was $8 million, okay? It was not split. It was not for 4 fights. It was $8 million for the fight. I hear another thing that gets brought up. Oh, well, that's only, if he remains champion. Okay, true, dude, but that's literally applicable to everybody. And if you are a big enough star who has done enough favors for the UFC, they actually don't even really enforce that. Israel Adesanya made way more money than Alex Pereira in the matchup, in their rematch, despite being the contender at that point in time, or the challenger, whereas Alex Pereira was the champion. Israel Adesanya kept his pay. Daniel Cormier, same thing. When he fought Stipe Miocic after losing the belt in their rematch, he was very vocal about the fact that the UFC did not alter his contract whatsoever. He made the same amount that he was making as a champion, okay? So I find it a little strange that they would just say high seven-figure purse, because if they were anywhere, so 8 million, if you can't do math, is still seven figures. It is close to eight figures, but it is still seven. Or if you were anywhere near that number, especially as a smaller organization, let's say you came up with 7 million, I feel like that would have been made public, because it would not just look bad on the UFC, but it would make you look like you have a lot of capital and a lot of money to actually continue on with your business. So if it was anywhere near that 8 million number, I truly do believe that they would have released the actual specific number. And if you remember anything from math class, you will know that 5 and up gets rounded up. So I would imagine that the number is probably 5.1 million per fight, and that allowed them to say, oh, well, it was a high seven-figure purse without lying technically, but also without disclosing the actual number. Now, another point that another detail of his pay-per-view was the pay-per-view bonus and the gate, and allegedly he will be getting 50% of the pay-per-view revenue in events that he has taken place in, obviously. Now, I want to point something out, okay? First of all, the PFL, I don't think they've ever done a pay-per-view event. If they have, it's been very minimal, maybe one, but I truly don't think so. So this is going to be a whole brand new business model for them, and man, again, I'm not trying to be negative. I'm not hating on Francis Ngannou. I'm looking at this objectively, okay? When the UFC puts on a pay-per-view event, typically it's not just the main event that people are excited for. Look at UFC 291, okay? And another thing, they don't charge extra for events like that. It's a set amount. But they've been doing a pay-per-view model for so long that their price is just accepted, right? I would imagine back in the day it probably wasn't that much. Now, like, the PFL being brand new when it comes to a pay-per-view model, I would argue that they're not going to set their pay-per-view price to be as high as the UFC's, because that would probably kind of like, it's like pricing yourself out. You know what I mean? If you've never put on an event before, and you, with all due respect, don't have a lot of big names in your organization that actually bring value to a pay-per-view card, you're not going to want to charge $60, $70 for a pay-per-view event based on one man, okay? It's just not. I just don't think it'll be the case. So I'm going to be very liberal and charitable and say that I would imagine they will probably charge around $50, maybe $49.99, $45.99, something around that. Now we need to be objective about, I keep seeing people say just because he's not the biggest draw does not mean he is not a draw. Francis Ngannou is not a draw. Okay? And if you want to move the goalpost and say, well, no, he's just not a big draw, but he can still draw in some numbers, well, that's, again, you moving the goalpost. Francis Ngannou's best pay-per-view sold around 300,000 buys, okay? Had a phenomenal storyline between him and an ex-teammate. It had a second title fight on there that people were absolutely excited about, Brandon Moreno versus Davidson Figueiredo, and it also was backed up by the three biggest letters in all of professional MMA, okay, the UFC. If we look at 300,000 pay-per-view buys, 100% you're going to have to take off a very large chunk just from the UFC. The UFC could sell, I would imagine, probably 100,000 to 150,000 pay-per-views on their own without having a massive headline, okay? And then you have to account for all the other fighters on the card, so a few thousand for Moreno, a few thousand for Figueiredo, a few thousand Frenchmen for Cyril Gane, and then you're left over to calculate whatever Francis Ngannou sold. So let's be very liberal and charitable just to show good faith, okay? Let's say that Francis Ngannou on his own sold 100 to 150,000 pay-per-views. Okay, now if you've got an amount of a pay-per-view in the PFL that is around what? Let's just, again, be very liberal and charitable, $50,000, or $50, pardon me. That means that Francis Ngannou, okay, and he will be, maybe they'll put Jake Paul on a card with him to help boost those pay-per-view numbers or anything like that. I would imagine, at most, he sells 150 to 200,000. And I know that there's going to be people that say that's fucking crazy. He probably won't do close to that. I agree. I'm trying to be charitable. If you sold 100,000 pay-per-views at a $50,000 rate, you are not bringing in that much revenue. You're just not, okay? You're bringing in what? $5 million, something like that. It's just not, it's not comparable to the UFC. And even if he gets the revenue split, fine. But if they put him on a card with Jake Paul, who will also probably get a revenue split, it's not going to be as simple as 50-50. We brought in $5 million, we're giving you $2.5. Like, it doesn't work like that. With the UFC, their threshold, if I'm not mistaken, is around 3 to 5% based on how many you sell. So for the first couple hundred, it's this much. After that, it's this much. And after anything over $1 million, it's this much. I would imagine Francis Ngannou probably could have negotiated to get the higher portion of that threshold if he wanted to, and I bet you that the UFC would have done that since they had already met quite a few of his demands. The ones that they did not want to meet, in my opinion, are completely fucking reasonable, and we'll go over those in a minute. Him and John Jones probably would have sold 800,000 to 1 million pay-per-view buys, I would imagine. And I don't think that's outlandish to say. John Jones versus Daniel Cormier, 1 and 2, both sold in the 800,000 realm. I think that MMA fans would have been a little bit more excited for a Francis Ngannou John Jones fight because it's the GOAT of the sport, whatever. John Jones coming back up a weight class, trying to see if he can beat the Predator, the guy who's been starching everybody in a couple minutes or whatever. Like, I don't think it's outlandish to say that it would have sold near that. And if you got 3 to 5% of that pay-per-view revenue, you would have been making an extra $3 to $3.5 million just like that, on top of the $8 million base pay that you would have gotten. Okay, he objectively would have made more money in the UFC, in my opinion, which is funny because then I just said objectively, but I don't think it's that hard. There will be people that come up with bullshit counter arguments, but I don't think that they hold much water. Another point or detail of his contract, obviously, can box and fight in MMA. Okay, cool, dude. Well, we've already learned that none of the real big names are interested in you whatsoever. Eddie Hearn has came out and said that Anthony Joshua wants nothing to do with that gimmick fight. He is solely focused on Deontay Wilder. I would imagine that both of these gentlemen have a rematch clause in case they lose, because that's pretty fucking typical in boxing. So they're going to be tied up with one another for probably a good while. Tyson Fury and Usyk or whatever the fuck are going to be tied up for a while, because I would imagine if Tyson Fury loses, he also has a rematch clause. These guys are tied up. Francis has already said, oh, well, I'm going to take a tune-up fight in the meantime. This is just proof that this guy does not have a whole lot of business sense, okay? It has been announced that he wouldn't be fighting in MMA until mid-2024. Why would you go and potentially get fucked up in a boxing match in that time, only to potentially damage your draw power, your star power as a draw in MMA, of which you are already not, okay? You're going to make it worse. If you go and fight somebody who has any boxing credentials whatsoever in the heavyweight division, I don't see him doing very well. He has very sloppy technique. I get that he can hit hard. Watch his fight with Rosenstrike. These are not punches that you are taught to throw in a fucking boxing gym, okay? Like, he can't box. I don't understand why people think that it is so reasonable for him to want to box these guys who, why would they take the risk of boxing a Francis Ngannou? The guy's sloppy, but hits hard as fuck. If Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, Usyk, any of these guys were to lose to Francis Ngannou, that would seriously damage their star power, and it would damage it way more than it would to lose to one of those guys, right? Like, if Tyson Fury lost to Anthony Joshua, or if Anthony Joshua lost to Tyson Fury, or Deontay Wilder beat, they are all credentialed high-level boxers. They are all world championship caliber boxers. It's not going to affect their star power a lot. There is no fucking promoter on the face of this planet that, in boxing, that is going to convince their fighter to fight Francis Ngannou, okay? We have a hard enough time seeing the best fight the best in boxing as is, because no promoters want to lose their cash cow. Right? That's what happens. We always see this. We see guys fight 20 fucking bums before they fight somebody so that they can get that 20-0 record so they can make a bunch of money. It's fucking stupid. And do you think that any of these promoters are going to be like, yeah, for sure, I'm going to risk my cash cow to fight that guy who can't fucking box, who if we lose to will be extremely embarrassing even though he hits hard as shit. The risk is not, it's not worth the reward, and the juice is not worth the squeeze. Like, it's just not, okay? Now, second, chairman of PFL Africa. Okay, cool, dude. That's a very nice honorary title, and they obviously did that because they could tell that he was a major sticking point for Francis Ngannou was like being a part of the business itself, right? He wanted a fucking board of directors seat or whatever at one championship. He wanted a fighter advocate that would literally act as a manager in against the interest of the UFC and advocating and negotiating for fighters and their pay that he wanted the UFC to pay for, which is fucking retarded. That is like a man paying for his wife's divorce attorney, right? And I know that does happen in some situations, but it's fucked up and it shouldn't, right? So why the fuck would the UFC pay for somebody to fight against them? And I just don't understand this shit. Also, the healthcare shit. Well, hey, can somebody tell me if PFL has healthcare for their fighters? I'm not sure. I would imagine not, okay? But regardless, the chairman of PFL Africa, fine, silly honorary title, good for you. They've already said, I think 2028 is when they're going to start looking at Africa. I could be mistaken on that date. It might have been 2026. That is if all things go well. How long did Elon Musk say the fucking Cybertruck was going to be coming out for? How long did he say the Roadster was going to be coming out for? Oh yeah, this year, 6 months this year. Yep, it'll be... Fucking, this is what businessmen do, dude. They don't want to give you a date that is so far away that your brain can't even conceive of it and nobody has any fucking interest whatsoever. This is if all things go perfectly according to plan, they will expand in Africa. This is not a guaranteed fucking position, okay? Now, the other thing, the $2 million for his opponents. It's a nice thought. Okay, good for you, dude. Now, I've seen some disingenuous reporting on this, or perhaps I'm just getting conflicting information. I have seen on a few places that it's a guaranteed minimum of $2 million for his opponent. And then I have seen reported by other places, and places that are typically on the side of guys like Francis Ngannou, typically a little anti-UFC, that are saying, no, it's not a $2 million guarantee. It's that his opponent can make as much as $2 million. And then I've also seen other places say that it's strictly for his debut opponent. Sorry, I just kicked my desk. Okay, the $2 million, if it is up to, then that's not $2 million, right? He can make anywhere up to $2 million, which is a cap on his opponent, which is actually worse, I would argue, than what, what most people think. But either way, dude, if it is a guaranteed, clearly that is to entice somebody of name value or stature to come over to the PFL to fight Francis Ngannou for their debut. I would imagine that will only actually entice like older washed up guys or guys that have literally no fucking aspirations to leave behind a legacy whatsoever. That is an extremely short-sighted incentive, right? Like, oh, I'll go get fucking knocked out for $2 million. Okay, dude. Whereas anybody that has aspirations of becoming like the best in the world is not going to take this up. They're going to go to the UFC. They'll take what they get paid until they become champion. Okay, because this is what it's a nice thought, okay? But that it's only a nice thought if it is the actual guaranteed minimum. If it is up to, then it is not a nice thought. It's a cap on what his opponents can make. And if it is only for his debut opponent, it'll be to do one good blockbuster event that won't sell that much anyways, and that'll be that. And it's also strange that they said 2 to 3 fights was the deal amount, because that makes me think that they might be a little unsure of how things are going to play out, and they don't want to go and... Like, why not 3, and why not 2? Why is it 2 to 3? It makes me think they're not so confident in what's about to transpire. I think honestly that this was probably on the side of PFL. I think this was a long-term publicity investment. I think that they got a lot of publicity through this, and it was probably worth the money for them, right? This is probably how they're looking at it. They're not thinking they're going to make a bunch of money off of Francis Ngannou. They're thinking that they've gotten a lot of publicity for essentially fucking yanking the UFC's heavyweight champion and signing him for a nice lucrative deal where they've fucking met all these random demands that fucking are completely, in my opinion, a little unreasonable. And I just think that it was a good publicity stunt, and I think that it was probably worth it for them in the long run. And let's say he only fights 2 times, or let's say he only fights 1 time because nothing's guaranteed. Well, then whatever, dude. They got a fuck ton of publicity. Good publicity to boot, okay? Because most, again, MMA media organizations are completely anti-UFC. And that's that. That's truly what I think this was. I think the PFL just wanted to look good, okay? And also, the last point, details of the contract, sponsors. Okay, I understand the thought, right? But the only place Francis Ngannou was not able to have sponsors previous to this while he was in the UFC was inside the cage, right? He's got almost 5 million followers on Instagram. He could have been making, and probably has been, honestly, 6 figures a month doing ads for companies and having sponsorships. The only place he's not allowed to is in the cage. And let's just contrast this a little bit, okay? Ryan Bader, 2-division champion at Bellator for a time. I don't know what his standings are now, but regardless, he was light heavyweight and heavyweight champion, okay? Objectively more decorated. I know that the organization is not nearly as good, doesn't have nearly the level of talent as the UFC, but he is more decorated than a Francis Ngannou. He was also a defending champion, right? Francis Ngannou defended his belt one time, and it was a controversial decision at that. He gets paid, Ryan Bader that is, gets paid $150,000 to show by Bellator. So that's 2 fight, right? He makes $150,000 to fight as a 2-division champion. He said, well, that's a little misleading because actually sponsors and all that. Okay, so you're not getting paid to be a fighter. You're getting paid to be a brand ambassador, which is fine. You like supplement your income in other areas. But he said that with all of his sponsors, it got him close to a 7-figure payday, which means he didn't even reach $1 million. After all of his sponsors, people are literally acting like online Francis Ngannou is going to make like $5 million a fight with sponsors. It's also based on how many eyeballs they think you're going to get, okay? If a fucking brand thinks, or not even thinks, if they're objective about the situation and they look at your previous pay-per-view numbers, they'll say, oh, well, there's not going to be that many eyeballs on it. So that it's really dependent on that as well, okay? But so, okay, cool, he can have sponsors in the cage. I don't think that it's going to supplement to the amount that the UFC would have paid him, but if that was a major sticking point for him, fine. I do think that the sponsor conversation is not as nuanced as it should be. The UFC looks the best. It looks the most professional. It is the most aesthetically pleasing to the eye, objectively. If you're going to say otherwise, you're fucking coping, okay? The reason for that is the uniform. It is. It's one of the major reasons, okay? Their production value is much better also, but the uniform helps. I remember back in the day seeing dudes with Condom Depot on their fucking ass, okay? I would imagine that is not ideal for, like, primetime cable television and shit like that, right? And if it wasn't for the UFC paving the way, all of these guys that still allow that wouldn't be on these major networks. So fucking shut up with that shit, okay? It's so annoying to me, man. It's so disingenuous. People fucking act as though any other businessman would do things differently. I don't. The goalpost has been moved so much, man. And people are saying that my side's doing this. This is not the case. It was supposed to be, and people that were not retarded knew this from the start. He was going to make $30 to $50 million boxing one of these extremely famous heavyweight boxers, which just would never be the case. He would never be the A side in boxing. He's not going to get the larger purse of the two. He's not even going to get a comparable purse of the two. He doesn't sell nearly as much. And I'm fucking sick of people acting like he does, okay? So we went from that to now he is signed with a smaller MMA organization for less money, but he gets a few little stipulations that he wanted and the UFC wasn't willing to oblige. The UFC was willing to oblige quite a few of them though, which is kind of makes him look more unreasonable. First of all, they only signed him to a 4-fight deal, which was at the request of Francis Ngannou, okay? There was no extensions, whatever. He was supposed to make a ton of money, and that's that. Like, it's fucking so annoying, dude. Now he's 2 to 3 fights, less money, gets less pay-per-view revenue. He gets a higher percentage, but he will objectively make less money on PFL pay-per-views than he would have in the UFC, but that's okay, dude. Now I want to talk about the UFC's response to this because I mentioned it quickly in one of my videos yesterday regarding the matchups that they announced the same day. First of all, I want to touch on this because people are saying that it is very petty and high school shit to do what the UFC did. First of all, dude, this is business. This is fucking not petty. This is not high school shit. This is business. And if you didn't expect this, then you're fucking naive, okay? And for Francis Ngannou, first of all, the blame always gets put on the UFC, and I'm not trying to simp for the UFC here, but here's what I am going to say. Francis Ngannou made a trailer, right? It was like a reel on Instagram. It was like a trailer with all these voices and tweets popping up in the background about how he fucked up, and then it said the date of which he would be making his announcement. May 16th, which was a Tuesday, okay? First of all, if you didn't want this to happen, Why the fuck would you supply the date? What I would have done in this situation, potentially, I would maybe give the date. Sure, May 16th, Tuesday, right? I would have waited until 11:59 fucking p.m. to make my announcement. I don't care how many people are awake. They'll see it when they wake up. You would have forced the UFC's hand to make their fucking announcement, trying to guess when you were going to make yours, and it would have fucked their shit up. You know what I mean? Or even wait till the next day. Fuck it. But also, I'm going to say I don't think Francis Ngannou is as innocent here as people like to make him out to be. Can anybody tell me what happens on a Tuesday in regards to the UFC? Anybody? Anybody at all? Because I thought of this immediately, and I would imagine that I wasn't the only one. If you've ever watched a press conference post-fight with when Dana White's being questioned, journalists are fucking autistic, and they're obsessed with who is the person who just got out of the cage 5 minutes ago gonna fight next, despite Dana White saying very clearly 9.9 times out of 10, I don't make fights the night of the fight. Right? When does he make fights, though? Anybody? Because I know, dude. On Tuesday, we get into the war room, me, Mick, and Sean, or whatever the fuck, and we make the fights. Tuesday. It's always been Tuesday. He says it almost every single event, every single post-fight press conference. We'll get into the war room on Tuesday, and we'll make the fights then. Do you think it's a coincidence that Francis Ngannou was trying to make his announcement on that Tuesday? Francis Ngannou was most likely trying to do the exact same thing that the UFC did to him. It was just that the UFC is more savvy in business, okay? This is my opinion. Anyways, I don't know about you guys. If it was just pure coincidence that he chose a Tuesday, and then he also released the date 3 days prior, well, then this is just pretty evident that, Francis, you do need a fucking manager, okay? Because you're not as smart as you think, okay? I just fucking don't get it, man. Why is it people have this inability to see when other people are potentially being bad actors? But when it comes to the other side, they're like, you're a fucking hater, you're a bad actor, you're fucking petty, this is some high school shit. The one journalist in particular that is in my thumbnail said that it was fucking disgusting, petty, and high school shit, while signal boosting the UFC's announcement. This fucking retard. Go look at his goddamn Instagram. After his Francis Ngannou post regarding the PFL, he fucking stepped right in line, made a post about Poirier Gaethje, made a post about Jan Blachowicz and Alex Pereira, signal boosting, and then wanting to fucking cry foul. Okay, bitch, you fucking pussy. Jesus Christ, dude. I mean, you guys tell me, dude. Do you think it's a fucking coincidence that he was trying to make this large announcement on a fucking Tuesday? Right? When the UFC's in there doing their matchmaking? I don't think so, dude. I think he was trying to steal some thunder. I think he thought that if he got it at the right time, he would be doing what the UFC did to him. And I think that the UFC proved in doing that Francis Ngannou is not nearly as popular as people fucking think. You know, his posts get like similar like numbers as fucking Angela Hill posts on the UFC's page. And Mackenzie Dern. These are not popular female fighters, man. And they're getting the similar or the same or more amount of likes and engagement as a Francis Ngannou tweet or post. This is like, these metrics are pretty objective, my guy. He is not a fucking superstar. He is not a massive draw. This contract is an L as of right now. Now, there's still time, not a lot, because he's in his late 30s, okay? He's going to be 37 this year. He'll be 38 by the time we see him fight in PFL, almost 38. And by the time we see him, if he ever does, get a boxing match against a high-level, popular heavyweight, he'll be close to 40 years old, okay? It is what it is, man. This is not me being a hater. This is me looking at it objectively. And the side that is like completely on board with the journalists that hate the UFC that have been behind Francis this whole time saying he's going to make 50 million. You guys have moved the goalposts so much that it was impossible for him to lose in your eyes. But if we're looking at this objectively and what the talks were before it was official that he was not going to re-sign with the UFC when his contract had first expired, compared to now, it's pretty fucking objective that this was an L. Okay, and I do blame the media largely for this. I also blame Francis, though. I think he was a little arrogant in thinking that he could do this without a manager and thinking that managers don't do a whole lot. They do a whole lot. And I don't think that even the mistake of releasing this news on the day that the UFC does their matchmaking, would have happened. And if it would have, I think it would have been done more slyly. You got to play chess, not checkers, Francis. Like, come on, dude. Anyways, dude, these are my thoughts on this subject matter. Again, I'm sure there will be a ton of comments, people saying that I'm hating and fucking all this shit, hating on a black man, all this shit. It's got nothing to fucking do with any of that shit, dude. I just don't think that he won here, and I think that it's all of the avid fucking anti-UFC supporters or whatever the fuck you want. I don't know what to call them. They're idiots. But either way, dude, like and subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate it. I'll see you at the next video. Bye-bye.